By 8 a.m. on day one of the entire nationwide invasion, one of the last of the largest of the battles set to occur within the larger DFW campaign, which was to occur within its very heart in the city of Irving, just to the south of the DFW International Airport. There were many moves throughout this campaign leading up to this particular battle unfolding, as effectively, first, the forces of the PLA's 59th Ready Reserve Group Army had to capture the largest of all the critical objectives throughout the entire map, which included the DFW International Airport, the downtowns of both Dallas and Fort Worth, as well as also the Taylor Army Heliport, and also the highways of I-35W and I-35E, which were the main invasion routes into the heartland of America for the external invasion components, moving deep inland as per fourth-generation warfare doctrine, leading into the last major combat operation in the city itself, as the following day major combat would unfold in the national grasslands, and even on day one there would still be additional combat against armed reactionary civilian elements which would pop up and effectively try to cause trouble for the invasion forces. The last effective defending American military unit was the 3rd of the 144th, and many of their companies were distributed throughout the area. The companies that comprised this battalion, which was a mechanized infantry battalion of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, located in parking garages, while others were more out in the open, as large, enormous artillery fire from a massive recurring barrage, as the PHLO3 battalion and its comprising batteries would launch over the course of hours many savage barrages into this area, along with also one of two PLLO1 155mm towed howitzer battalions, and also one of two 152mm towed howitzer battalions. These, of course, firing rocket-assisted projectiles into the area, including also the PLLO1 battalion, as from their current positions in the general west of the battle space, the further away targets were, the larger the charges, of course, and the types of shells in terms of range had to be utilized. And of course, the 155mm towed howitzers had the longest range shells of all. The WS-35R rocket-assisted, satellite-guided projectiles, which were also exceedingly accurate, and their trajectory could be changed mid-flight if there was a change in targeting data, or the target were to move, if it was a target capable of movement. As it pertained to the towed howitzer forces of both the 16th Infantry Division, as they had a battalion of PLZ-05 155mm towed howitzer systems, as did the 35th Armored Brigade of the 59th Group Army, as well as the 16th Infantry Division and 35th Armored Brigade were subunits which were part of the Ready Reserve 59th Group Army within this particular battle space. The attached 83rd Air Assault Brigade contributed enormously to the capture and or destruction of many critical objectives in this area, especially when it came to the seizure of key objectives such as the downtowns of both Dallas and Fort Worth, as well as also the DFW International Airport, which was one of the crown jewels of objectives in this particular campaign, as 3 armored battalions from the 35th Armored Brigade in league with 2 air assault battalions from the active duty 83rd Air Assault Brigade from the 83rd PLA Group Army, who were, for the express purposes of this campaign, attached to the 59th Group Army, had moved in initially to cut off any possibility of reinforcement or escape as it pertained to the forces that were defending the DFW International Airport, as the tandem anti-SAT and cyber strikes had initially completely severed all communications and ISR capabilities of the Americans in conjunction with the onbooting of ground-based electronic warfare assets as well as aviation-based electronic warfare assets, as the H-6K heavy strategic bombers and the JH-7 aircraft, of course, had these capabilities as well, as these forces had cut all communications and command and control between the headquarters of Headquarters Company over the entire 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, who also commanded the attached units from the 155th Armored Brigade combat team, the 2nd of the 198th Armored Battalion, and the 1st of the 204th SHORAD Battalion from the Mississippi National Guard 66 Troop Command. These forces in the International Airport, having been completely and totally cut off from their command elements of their brigade, were effectively on their own as the battle kicked off and the invasion ensued. As the capture of the DFW International Airport effectively lasted until 3:45 a.m., when major combat operations for the seizure of this facility had effectively ceased. By 4 a.m., the air assault battalions, in conjunction with the armored battalions, again, as there were 2 participating air assault battalions in this operation, and there were 3 armored battalions in this operation, would now conduct, between all 5, a massive 2-hour-long consolidation and logistical resupply operation effort, as there were vehicles in need of maintenance activities after this large-scale operation, as well as also the complete and total topping off of all fuel and ammunition, as well as giving the troops time required to eat and catch up on their sustenance, as well as more. As all of this was underway, the air assault forces would effectively be left in overall control over the airport grounds, as the next hour after the 2-hour-long logistical resupply and consolidation operation would see the 3 armored battalions and the command echelon of the 35th Armored Brigade, as well as that of the 16th Infantry Division in the south of the entire battle space, coordinating an effort as they were commanded to by the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion over the entire 59th Group Army of the Chinese PLA, to effectively prepare for a major last assault against the final defending American military unit and a large grouping of armed reactionary civilians holed up in the Irving area of the city within its very heart, as most, if not all by this time, of the major resistance in the actual metropolitan area itself had effectively been neutralized, although there would still be residual flare-ups on day 1 of armed reactionary civilian activities, and even into day 2, a final major operation in the national grasslands outside of the city to hunt down thousands of armed reactionary civilian elements who had fled the metro area. Within the city itself, the city of Irving would effectively resemble almost a modern day Battle of Berlin type situation, if not the rest of the city already effectively looking like such after such heavy artillery, missile from cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes, and air strikes and air raids. The city of Irving would effectively be an enormous rubbled wasteland of gutted building facades and rubble piles, and effectively blasted out factory complexes, as many of these had been hit by cruise and tactical ballistic missile systems. Even a Department of Defense office in the Irving city had been hit badly in this way, as well as by artillery strikes coming from the 19th Artillery Brigade's northern grouping of firing battalions consisting of the PHLO-3 300 millimeter rocket battalion, as well as also one of two PLL-01 howitzer battalions, as well as also one of two PLL-66 howitzer battalions, firing rocket-assisted projectiles into this particular area to augment the already enormously destructive, devastating PHLO-3 300mm rocket battalion forces, as the firing batteries that comprised this battalion of PHLO-3s effectively, with their multiple systems in each battalion, could rain down total mass death and destruction on a wide area consisting of many square miles, as each system alone, a single PHLO-3, could shower an area larger than a grid square or a 1 by 1 kilometer area with absolute and total annihilation. And as multiple systems could target the exact same target, or they could target a wide area, massive areas of the city had been laid waste to in this particular way, as 300 millimeter fire, as well as 155 and 152 millimeter fires had blanketed this particular area of the city, as well as also areas of Dallas itself, as areas around the downtown were showered by 300 millimeter strikes, and also the WS-35R satellite-guided shells from the 155 millimeter battalion, which could actually reach this area at the furthest extent of their range, as these systems pounded this area and hit targets around the downtown, as the downtown was in the process of being captured by a single air assault battalion. These terrain denial, as well as also precision strikes against armed reactionary civilian clusters on the outskirts of the downtown, had proved absolutely devastating, not only to these types of defending forces, but also as well to the armed forces assets in this area of the American 155th Armored Brigade combat teams, 2nd of the 198th Armored Battalion, tasked with defending this side of the Metroplex, having had been bivouacked in the east of Dallas in an area known as Deep Ellum, as the PLA forces were landed in their diamond shape to capture the downtown of Dallas, which the downtown area itself was not excessively large, and these 4 air assault companies back to the hilt by loitering munitions, as well as also their own very powerful and advanced attack helo gunships, their Z-10s, and their own built-in ground-based 82 millimeter mortar company were more than enough to seize control of this area, just as they were flushing out the downtown area of Fort Worth. They were effectively doing the same in downtown Dallas, as they went through many key objectives within the larger objective that was the downtown, in order to clear it out and in effect, turn it into a colonial red zone after the battle had been won and the invasion had concluded as a total Chinese, PLA, and Allied victory. As of course, the Chinese PLA and the Chinese paramilitary forces, which were all combat grade, were the largest contributing forces in the entire nationwide invasion, naturally, as China had the largest combined armed forces on the face of the earth. As they, in this particular campaign, were smashing their way to victory, crushing any and all defending forces that sat in their path. They, by after 4 a.m., had all but seized complete control over downtown and had begun their consolidation operations throughout this particular area, as one of two armored battalions from the 16th Infantry Division had effectively, along with the Air Assault Battalion from the 83rd Active Duty Air Assault Brigade, moved into this particular area. And while the air assault forces seized control of the downtown area intact as much as humanly possible, the forces of the 2nd of the 198th on the outer periphery were effectively enveloped by the battalion and its comprising elements from the 16th Infantry Division of their armored battalion committed to battle, and engaged and destroyed, while the elements of the Air Assault Battalion effectively aided in this effort, as not only were they to secure downtown intact, but they were to hold it, and part of holding it was defending it and preventing the 2nd of the 198th's comprising companies from entry, and thus they too partook in this large combat operation. And now, this air assault battalion, too, would effectively be left in control of the downtown of Dallas after the area was consolidated. And the armored battalion from the 16th Infantry Division, having had fought its way into the downtown and destroyed the 2nd of the 198th upon having had crossed the Trinity River into the downtown area after a logistical resupply period itself, would move to capture the now abandoned Love Field Airport, which itself was a relatively sizable airport. And as they would move in, they would later engage armed reactionary civilians that would effectively materialize at a later time during the day, with the last real battle of the first day occurring along I-635 as yet another grouping would materialize, coming out from hiding places, being immediately seen by the near complete total PLA surveillance apparatus, and thus the forces from within the battalion of armored forces from the 16th Infantry Division would be sent to engage these forces as well and secure this segment of highway, as even the secondary interstates throughout the city were seen as critical for the colonization efforts as well as logistical and troop movements, and thus all highway networks had to be cleared of any and all hostile forces. But for the time being, the last major battle for control of this entire node would be the battle for the city of Irving, as the forces of the 35th Armored Brigade, not participating in this operation, as the same 3 battalions from the 35th who captured the international airport would be partaking in this operation, would be moving into place into the new forward operations base, which was the international airport, such as the SHORAD battalion forces of the 35th Armored Brigade, as this battalion would move into this area to assist the two air assault battalions in its occupation from the 83rd Air Assault Brigade, as these forces lacked any real air targets, as there was no viable air threat left by 8 a.m. They would now move into and assist in the consolidation and control of the international airport, as the consolidation efforts would be an ongoing effort, as the two different National Construction and Production Corps battalions in this particular battle space, the 405th and the 58th, would not only be fortifying the red zones captured, the downtown of Dallas and downtown of Fort Worth, by the two different air assault battalions from the 83rd, but they would also be building up the airport facilities, including Meacham, Love Field, and DFW International Airport, as well as also the smashed Naval Air Station and smashed Taylor Army Heliport in the city of Grand Prairie, all into forward operations bases, which would take time and effort, but they would work quickly to effectively conduct these operations. But in order to do so, again, the consolidation operations would be an ongoing effort, as maintaining control of captured objectives would be a constant effort. And as the three participating armored battalions after 4 a.m. will have taken a 2-hour time period to conduct logistical resupply operations, which included maintenance, again, topping off fuel and armaments, and also allowing troops to have time to replenish their sustenance, as in eating and drinking, and taking a rest period before their next major push. Yet another hour after this would be concluded would be spent planning the next major push, as the command echelon over the entire 59th PLA Group Army and over all the forces as a whole, including the attached 83rd Air Assault Brigade and even the two National Construction paramilitary battalions of the Chinese forces, they would be effectively with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, using all the ISR available data at the moment, and would be liaisoning with the command elements of the 35th Armored Brigade of their headquarters and support battalion, as well as the headquarters of headquarters company over the entire 16th ID, as it was comprised of two brigades with their own headquarters and support battalions. The headquarters of headquarters company was the administrative and command elements of the 16th ID. These forces would effectively be coordinating with the headquarters of headquarters company of the 59th PLA Group Army, whose commanding general, as the rank of general, was the highest rank in the PLA, as generals commanded group armies, and the supreme commander of the PLA was a general rank, and they were picked from among group army commanders and rotated to effectively be the chief of staff of the entire PLA, as group armies, as there were many throughout the active reserve and ready reserve PLA forces, there were many generals at the rank of general, as lieutenant generals were effectively the next rank below them. The general of the 59th Group Army was in command of this entire campaign and all the forces partaking thereof. And although the National Production and Construction Corps battalions were paramilitary forces, they too were attached and beneath PLA command for this operation. And the general would be effectively liaisoning with the senior colonel of the 35th Armored Brigade and the major general over the 16th ID in order to command their battalions to conduct this operation together, as this would be a joint operation, much like the capture of the DFW International Airport was between the forces of the 83rd Air Assault Brigade and 35th Armored Brigade. This would be a joint operation between two mechanized infantry battalions of the 16th ID and the three armored battalions of the 35th Armored Brigade, after they had all conducted their logistical resupply operations, as this would be a major push to finish off the last major area in the entire metroplex of resistance, as this was the last viable defending force in the form of the 3rd of the 144th. By 8 a.m., the operation was set to begin, as between 7 and 8 a.m., the 3 armored battalions and 2 mechanized infantry battalions would have been moving into place from their staging areas, with the 2 that having had taken Grand Prairie sitting on the Taylor Army heliport, now preparing to move into place to conduct an envelopment around these forces, guided in through the ever-present real-time AI battlefield data processing system, whose eyes and ears were the gargantuan surveillance apparatus of the PLA, which consisted of quadcopter assets, the high-altitude reconnaissance assets or drones, and the satellite assets as well as radar assets. All of these work together to inform in real time the real-time AI battlefield data processing system of all activities going on the literal and proverbial map, so to speak, as in this area, despite the heavy rocket and shell bombardments coming from the 19th Artillery Brigade's 3 firing battalions comprising batteries in each battalion, the area, which was now reduced to complete abject total ruination, was also hit by cruise missiles such as YJ-18Cs, Calibers, as well as DH-10As and others, as there were many targets within the Irving area, just as there were throughout the whole Metroplex. The area had also been hit around the airport periphery by the H-20 heavy strategic stealth bomber aircraft. And as these aircraft, both the H-20s and H-6Ks, having by 2 a.m. jettisoned their entire payloads, they had returned to base, they had conducted their RTB, and as heavy strategic bombers took time in order to prepare for their next missions, would be returning by 9 a.m., as the flight time to this area from their bases was relatively short, at about an hour and a half. The time to prep these heavy strategic bombers, both the H-20s and H-6Ks, for their missions, as the ground crews worked like pit crews, would take roughly 4 hours. So therefore, by 9 a.m., these would be conducting a return to the battle space, and they would be kept in flight by the refueling aircraft, as the refueling aircraft, both the YY, or also called YU-20s of the PLAAF, as well as also there were H-6 versions of refueling aircraft, and even the Russian IL-78s would be conducting rotations into the North Texas and Southern Oklahoma areas to keep all of the different fighter, strike, and or ground attack aircraft, as well as also heavy strategic bomber aircraft in flight, as there would always be refueling aircraft on station from here on out. The heavy strategic bombers would now be able to loiter in the area until all of their payloads had been jettisoned on targets below, and some of these aircraft would even be utilized in the next major operation to completely and totally eradicate the 3rd of the 144th, as this particular battalion had its comprising companies spread throughout the area amid over 1,000 armed reactionary civilians, as the original number of armed reactionary civilians had been far larger, as this number was closer to 2,000 total by now. After the heavy rocket and shell barrages, the original number of 5,000 had been severely reduced, although there were many means by which to effectively hide from these different barrages and strikes. The survivors, having had now re-emerged, would be soon assaulted from different sides by these PLA battalions moving into place for the final push, as there would be a last major objective, which would be the command staff of the 3rd of the 144th, hold up in the now destroyed KLX aircraft factory in Irving, which was a major target hit by tactical, cruise, missiles, and also artillery strikes. The artillery battalion of the 35th Armored Brigade, as well as the artillery battalion of the 16th ID, along with the same artillery battalions of the 19th Artillery Brigade, would all be partaking in strikes into the Irving area in support of their forces moving in, as the armored battalions, having had taken the DFW International Airport, would now be moving in to conduct this final assault in a Battle of Berlin type operation, as the area they would be assaulting would be largely already completely ground down and reduced to abject rubble piles, and also complete and total crumbled building facades and knocked out, burned out, blown out factory compounds, as there would be very few buildings that would be left even remotely standing in this area. The defending forces would use the rubble to their best advantage as defensive positions against the assaults, which should be heavily reinforced by the PLA artillery assets, as well as also the air power, which would be returning, as the ground attack or strike aircraft and the fighter aircraft, now returning heavily laden with air-to-ground munitions, the J-11 Fighter Squadron, the J-10 Squadron, and the JH-7 Strike Aircraft Squadron, which were specifically earmarked to this campaign alone, along with the Strategic Bomber Aircraft, would again partake in this particular operation and would assist in smashing these forces to vicious effect, as the companies comprising the 3rd of the 144th had been relatively fortunate in that many of them, the companies, the 3 of 4 combat companies, the Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie Company, had been bivouacked in multi-story concrete steel reinforced parking garages, which in effect saved their vehicles from complete and total destruction in the artillery strikes, which had been going on for hours, although the top floors of these parking garages were now largely non-existent. The lower floors had shielded these companies from total annihilation, including the personnel who had remained in these places until the barrages had ceased, as the artillery forces of the 19th Artillery Brigade, of their firing battalions that had partaken in these massive barrages, needed time to conduct maintenance as well as large-scale logistical resupply operations themselves, as their forward-supplied shells and rockets effectively needed to be replenished, as more needed to be brought up from other CCP regime properties, as of course when the invasion begun, these forces logistically had hundreds of thousands of shells and rockets between all 3 battalions, and now that these had been expended in these gargantuan strikes, more would be brought forward from an even larger logistical depot under the control of the Headquarters and Support Battalion of the 19th Artillery Brigade, as it would take hours to truck in another gargantuan stock of shells and rockets in the form of the 300mm rockets in order for these battalions to be prepared for the operation set to begin at 8 a.m., as the last major barrage conducted against these forces in the Irving area, as this whole area was laid and flat to the ground. Effectively, it was razed to the ground by all these strikes, and of course also the cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes on specific targets within the area, whether military, industrial, or also some political targets, such as the DoD offices and other types of targets in relation to that. The last major strike, having had concluded at 5 a.m., would give 3 hours for the massive trucking in effort from the nearby CCP regime property of the headquarters and support battalion of the 19th Artillery Brigade to effectively move in enough ample quantities of shells and rockets to support the next big push. As there, of course, in any rapid tempo of operations, even an operation that was already moving so immensely fast, as in the history of warfare, battles typically moved far slower than was moving already this campaign, and most of it was due to the streamlining of combat data and the immense ISR and IT capabilities of the Chinese. The other aspect was the multiple decades of stockpiling logistics on all of the CCP regime properties upon which all of these forces initiated. Each and every single solitary battalion had immense stockpiles of logistics to begin with, and even more so were the support battalions comprising the 59th Support Brigade, as well as also the headquarters and support battalions of each and every brigade-sized unit, and of course, that included the 2 brigades that comprised the 16th Infantry Division, as they had a headquarters company, which was their command and administrative elements, while their headquarters and support battalions over each of the 2 comprising brigades were the command and logistical elements of each brigade in their division, as the combat engineers likewise also had gargantuan stocks of their own units' logistics on their own CCP regime properties. They too were already achieving immense results in their area of operations in the general east of the entire metroplex, as they had cleared many flanks as it stood and seized key highway infrastructure, as well as destroyed large numbers of enemy combatants in their AO. The area of Burleson, which had been seized very early on, was now established as a key logistical supply route, as the 59th Support Brigades battalions would be operating this area, whereby the soon-to-arrive by late on day 1 external invasion forces, according to 4th generation warfare doctrines, as this node will be completely under PLA control by the end of day 1, with the exception of the National Grasslands, although it was out of the way and not a threat to the operations of the external invasion forces. The area would be used as a massive logistical resupply center for the external invasion forces, upon which, as they required fuel or possible ammunition topping off, as possibly smaller forces in remote areas en route possibly tried to engage them, and thus they might have had to expend ammunition on their massive miles-long convoy operations against these forces. It was the major nodes that really counted in these operations, as the concept of 4th generation warfare dictated that the nodes be brought under control, which were the major and medium-sized cities and occasionally small cities with key objectives, in order that in these large population centers, the massive miles-long convoys of external invasion forces would not have to stop and get off, waste time engaging enemies, only to reemerge and move on, as this wasted too much time, and it was up to the Trojans to attain all the objectives deep inland, as well as clear all the major nodes to make transit through these areas seamless for the heavy-handed reinforcements, which were the external invasion prongs moving in from without the nation, as in crossing the borders from Mexico and Canada and moving deep inland before fanning out to reinforce the Trojans, as the externals, for once in a war doctrine, were not the key player. They were the reinforcement. The Trojans were the movers and shakers of the operations, as they already begun inland and were capturing all the objectives according to this doctrine. The Trojans were the main force in this invasion. The externals were their reinforcements. That was the whole purpose of fourth gen doctrines, while also implementing the use of exceedingly high technologies never before seen or used in warfare, or at least not utilized in some cases to such a massive extent. And artificial intelligence was a massive component of this high technology, as were the sheer numbers and types of drones and robotics, as well as also other newer types of weaponry, which included even so-called space-based weapons, or weapons used high in the stratosphere to strike targets below with different types of weaponry, whether directed energy, whether tungsten rods, or other types of weapons, as there were many, many types of weapons, from hypersonic weapons to laser or directed energy weapons, so to speak, and also newer, better missiles and aircraft and ships and ground vehicles and even certain types of chemical weapons, such as a weaponized opioid known as fent, which in very small quantities is enough to kill large populations, was being used in this invasion. And as in this particular operation, the PLA forces, by 8 a.m., had already achieved the vast majority of their objectives. Even the downtown of Fort Worth by this time, which had been effectively seized by air assault forces of another air assault battalion, as both Dallas downtown and Fort Worth downtown were each taken by a single air assault battalion, although in Dallas, of course, the accompanying armored battalion from the 16th ID was there effectively to destroy American armor in the area, such as in the Clyde Warren Park, which effectively sat above the northern boundary of the downtown of Dallas, which was effectively a spur tunnel which ran beneath it, both of which were contested in the battle against the 2nd of the 198th, as the armored battalion from the PLA 16th Infantry Division had moved into this area in order to prevent the recon and force of the American forces, and thus engage and destroy them and prevent them from escape. As this video has effectively been the introduction video of part 13, which effectively features the last major large-scale combat operations within the Metroplex proper against an actual military unit of the defending forces, as by this point, their command elements of their headquarters company, the actual command staff, were all captured and some completely eradicated in the southeast of the city of Fort Worth long before 8 a.m., leaving very little left of their unit remaining. As again, effectively all that was left of the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team by this point was the 3rd of the 144th. As the 3rd of the 144th consisted of their headquarters of Headquarters Company, which was their command elements, as well as their Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta teams, which were their companies, which were their combat companies. And then there was the Foxtrot Company, which was the forward deployed support company, which were their logistical assets, forces, that were effectively paired to them and attached, coming from the now defunct 949th Brigade Support Battalion, as this battalion had companies which were all paired with the different combat battalions within that comprised the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team. As the 3rd of the 144th was now all that remained of the 56th, the 2 mechanized infantry battalions moving into the area would assist the 3 armored battalions moving into the area to conduct a total envelopment of this portion of the city of Irving, for the sole express purpose of then sending in forces to effectively annihilate the remains of the 3rd of the 144th, as they were the key objective, and their leadership, hiding out in the now destroyed KLX aircraft plant, were the main target of the PLA forces, wanted either dead or alive, as the armed reactionary civilians would also be gradually cleared out and mopped up by the PLA forces. These ground forces would have enormous, massive air support, combat drone, and kamikaze drone support from their loitering munitions, such as their CH-901As, as well as also heavy, enormous artillery support from their own artillery battalions within the 16th Infantry Division, as well as also the 35th Armored Brigade, which both had a PLZ-05 self-propelled 155mm howitzer battalion, as well as also the artillery forces of the 19th Artillery Brigade, namely the PLL-01 battalion on station in the northern grouping of firing battalions, the PLL-66 battalion in the same grouping, 1 of 2, and the single PHL-03 300mm rocket battalion, as these 3 firing battalions would also play a massive role in targeting the final large grouping of remaining defending forces that were operating in this area. Again, all movement guided, directed through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, using the ISR capabilities to pinpoint enemies in order to guide these forces to effectively outflank, outmaneuver, and surround them in these areas, which also would include a smaller grouping of armed reactionary civilians that would get cut off from the main body by these 2 mechanized infantry battalions being sent into this area. They also would be destroyed easily with heavy artillery support into this area, as all of it was guided through the ISR capabilities, through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. This is what guided the commanders on the ground to be the most effective commanders ever before in history, and these forces to be the most flexible ever before in history, as a 5-battalion force could surround this large of an area and be this effective against this many forces without having to worry about anything on their flanks, because having now had totally effectively cleared nearly all resistance in this entire battle space, they could focus and hone in on this last remaining area and mop it up before then being effectively in full control of this entire node, only having to deal with residual appearing or materializing, as it could be said, armed reactionary civilian elements popping up, which would be very small, very few and far between throughout the rest of the day, the first day, as the vast majority of the remaining armed reactionary civilians were by now all holed up in the national grasslands and trying to effectively think of what they could do next, as logistics meant everything to a force. The defending forces at this point, everywhere, were a logistical basket case, and it would take a lot of work to get them up to par. And as the PLA forces were moving effectively at such a high tempo of operations, the ability for the defenders to catch up logistically was an exceedingly difficult task and would effectively take the utmost devotion and care and consideration and smarts to be able to work around. And there would be heavy continued loss of life ahead, as the non-combatant populations that hadn't fled this area had largely been eradicated through the mass firepower of the incoming 300 millimeter, 155 millimeter, and 152 millimeter artillery barrages. There were very few, if any, non-combatants remaining by 8 a.m. when the last major push was set to occur, at least within the Metroplex itself, against the Irving area, as in this area, the enormity of the artillery strikes was so heavy that, again, there was very few, if any, non-combatants remaining, as the rest had either long since fled or had perished in the strikes, which in effect was many tens of thousands by this point, just in the Irving area, in the area that was now being cordoned by 8 a.m. by the 2 mechanized infantry battalions departing from the Taylor Army heliport, having had been captured in their push to clear Grand Prairie of all armed reactionary civilian and the tiny military resistance on the post, and forces moving in from the DFW International Airport to cordon this area, which were the 3 armored battalions that assisted in taking the International Airport with the 2 air assault battalions that had moved in from the south. The 35th Armored Brigade and 16th Infantry Division would now utilize their forces in this operation to clean out this last area of resistance in the entire Metroplex. This battle would effectively last hours. There will be more to come in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines, utilizing real world everything